Okay, welcome everyone. This is Prince George's first panel discussion ever, and this webinar is on U.S. debt and its global implications. My name's Sean Simmons. I'm president of CIC Prince George, and really excited to have three learned economists on the panel today to participate in the discussion. It includes Louise Shainer from the Brookings Institution, Marc Goldwein from the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget, and providing a Canadian perspective, Jack Mintz from the School of Public Policy at the University of Calgary. So the idea for this panel really first emerged when I was hearing a offhanded comment from US Congressman Michael Waltz on the timeline for US insolvency. And I think he was talking about Medicare at the time, and that it had been moved from 2030 to 2025, 2026. Now, I have no idea if this is a true statement or not, but it really got me thinking, what would happen if something like that actually took place? What would the effects be, and how would they reverberate not only through the US economy, but basically all the other economies around the world that are tightly connected to the US dollar? So that basically initiated the idea for this panel. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to have basically a 10 to 15 minute presentation from each of the three panelists to share their thoughts on the current state of the US debt and what they see are the primary risks. And then what we want to do is open it up for some questions. So a little bit of housekeeping here first. There will be no chat function today. Unfortunately, I don't have a moderator to help with that. So all the questions will be through the question Q&A button on your screen. So make sure that's the place if you want to ask any questions to enter them there. And without further ado, let me introduce our first panelist today, Dr. Louise Shainer. So Louise is the Robert S. Kerr Senior Fellow in Economic Studies and Policy Director for the Hutchins Center on Fiscal and Monetary Policy. She had served as an economist with the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System since 1993, most recently as the senior economist in the Fiscal Analysis section for the Research and Statistics Division. In her time at the Fed, she was also appointed Deputy Assistant Secretary for Economic Policy at the U.S. Department of Treasury and served as Senior Staff Economist for the Council of Economic Advisors. Before joining the Fed, Shainer was an economist at the Joint Committee on Taxation. She pursues research on health spending and other fiscal issues. She received her PhD in economics from Harvard, as well as an undergraduate degree in biology. Welcome, Louise. And let me see, I'll just have to flip over and I guess figure out how I get myself off the main panel. Oh, I think I can just do it here. Add spotlight.
There you go.
Oh, replace spotlight. Oh, now I've really done it. Here, I think I can remove my spotlight. There you go.
There we go. Now I've got the spotlight. Well, thank you so much for having me, and hello to everybody on the webinar. So let's talk a little bit about the US debt situation. So since I'm first, I'll give some basic background. So the federal debt, which is what we're basically talking about, state and local governments in the United States have some debt, but not a lot. Most of the government debt is in the US hands. Before the Great Recession, debt bounced around as a share of GDP, but it was kind of in the 35 to 40% of GDP, give or take, for decades before the Great Recession. By the end of the Great Recession, debt had more than doubled to about 80% of GDP, which we already thought was a lot higher than what we'd expected. And now with the COVID pandemic and the really huge fiscal response that the US has undertaken, debt to GDP in 2020 reached 100% of GDP. So remember, something like 40% of GDP before the Great Recession to 100 last year. And that was before the enactment of the most recent fiscal stimulus package, which was another $1.9 trillion. And so we're talking about debt to GDP that's going to be, maybe near 110% this year. We don't have a score yet. But so very, very, very rapid increase in debt. And then looking forward, right, this sort of like the Great Recession, the pandemic are kind of one-time events, but it's not the case that we expect debt to go back down. Why? Because we're really in the middle of this transition that we've been expecting for decades of the aging of the baby boomers, which is keeps the US debt on this trajectory of ever increasing debt, right? So it's going, given our tax revenues are not as large as our expenditures, that gap is going to be growing and then it will stabilize, but the debt is expected to keep growing. So the Congressional Budget Office, which is our official scorekeeper, in their most recent estimates, has the debt to GDP ratio basically going from 100% in 2020 to close to 200% by 2050. At our current debt to GDP ratio is pretty much, it was a little bit higher in World War II, temporarily around 106. By this year, it's going to be bigger. And then for there on out, it's going to be bigger than what we've seen historically. So we have a high level and rising level of debt. What's causing the debt to rise looking forward? I think of it as two main things. One is in the US, most places around the world, particularly in the United States, health spending tends to increase faster than GDP. The US government provides a lot of health care. It provides, we don't have universal health, but we have health for poor people through Medicaid, premium tax credits that help for the Affordable Care Act, and most importantly, Medicare, which is a universal health program for people 65 and older. So increasing health spending puts pressure on the budget. On top of that, we have the baby boom generation retiring, which makes more people eligible for Social Security and Medicare. So Medicare is kind of the double whammy: high health spending, high increase in healthcare, more and more people eligible. Those are the kind of fundamentals that are putting pressure on the budget. Plus, we don't even just pay for, even today, we don't pay for all of our expenditures. So we've got these primary deficits that keep going. So big increases in debt. And let me finally, once some people think, oh, well, the baby boom generation is going to retire and then everything will be better again. And that's not the right way to think about it. The retirement of the baby boom generation sort of represents the transition to what we expect to be a permanently older economy. So fertility fell after the baby boom, and it has stayed low and is even declining more. The lower your fertility rate, the fewer kids there are per parent, which means eventually the fewer workers there are per elderly person. So that's what the situation looks like. We're sort of in the midst of this transition at a much higher level of debt than we thought would be the case, and we're still increasing risk. So you might think, oh my God, debt is so high, we should all be really worried about it. I am one person here who is not worried about the debt. Let me tell you why now. Okay, so there's two things that have happened in the economy that have really made me sort of rethink the way I think about debt. The first thing is, I just told you this story of debt rising and rising and rising and rising. Any economist, if you had asked what would have happened if the debt to GDP ratio went from 40 to 100, was that, oh my God, interest rates should be going through the roof. Well, the opposite is really happening, not causal. It's not because debt went up that interest rates have been falling, but interest rates have been falling for 30 years, right? The secular decline in interest rates, it's true if you look at real interest rates, sort of these TIPS are inflation protected real interest rates. It's true nominals. It's true of non-treasury assets, just rates of return on other assets. And it's true globally. So something structurally is different about the global economy that has lowered interest rates. So even though our debt is way higher than we thought it would be, our interest payments are way lower, right? So our interest, the real interest rate has just barely gotten even positive in the last few really days. It's been negative, the real interest rate for the last year. So we have really much lower interest rates than we thought. Now, the truth of the matter is no economist can tell you how high the debt can get before causing problems. Like at one point, some people had this idea, oh, it's 90% of GDP, but that was wrong. We really don't know how much debt is too much. But one thing we do know is the lower the interest rate, the bigger that number is, right? Lower interest rates, you can think of it in two ways. You can say, well, when interest rates are low, then sort of the amount of tax revenues that you have to use is much lower to pay the interest on the debt, so you don't have to worry about it. You can also think about it from a macroeconomic perspective. Why do we care about debt in the first place? We care about debt because we think the more debt we have, the poorer we make our grandchildren and our children. From a macroeconomic perspective, we worry about crowding out, right? If the government is borrowing a lot of money from people, there is less money to go into investment declines. And the way that happens is the interest rate goes up, right? There's greater demand for funds, the government takes it, the interest rate goes up, private investors say, well, at those interest rates, I don't want to invest. Low interest rates are a symptom of not great investment opportunities. So something has changed in the world where investment opportunities are just not as great as they used to have to be. So the crowding out effects are much less bad. Now, interest rates are low, and of course they're hard to predict though. So they may be low now, but like, are they going to stay low? So how do you think about that? I'm going to say the first one, they are hard to predict, but but people have been trying to understand what has caused interest rates to fall here and across the world. And the kind of reasons they've come up with, there's a bunch of hypotheses having to do with a demographic change and productivity and inequality and changes in technology. All of those tend to suggest that rates are going to stay low. And the markets think that rates are going to stay low. So a pretty good guess is that rates are going to be low, at least for quite a while, and a lot lower than you might have thought before. So what does that say about how much debt we can have? So there's different ways of doing the exercise, but one exercise you could do is to say, and you're trying to decide how much debt is too much. And you say, well, at a particular level of debt, what interest payments would we have to make on that debt in order for the debt to GDP to be stable? Like, what money would we actually have to take out of our tax revenues and have this primary surplus, right? Not borrowing anymore, but actually paying back in order to stabilize the debt to GDP ratio. And if you do that exercise using a forecast of interest rates that assume they go up over time and assume the debt is rising over time. So this is the Congressional Budget Office assumes current law, debt's going to rise, interest rates will rise. If you do that, honestly, the interest payments that you have to make to stabilize the debt stay below the payments that you had to do to stabilize the debt in the 1980s until about 2050, close to 2050. So eventually we're going to have to do something about the debt. Debt can't rise forever, right? At some point rates will go up, people will stop lending to us, but the numbers at which that sort of those things are worry are much higher than you would have thought before because of the decline in interest rates. Okay. So that's number one. Low interest rates are a game changer. The second thing is that the economics profession has put together a lot of really solid evidence over the past 10 to 15 years, showing that a lot of government spending is actually government investing. So spending money, particularly for poor families and poor kids, it could be healthcare, education, food assistance, housing assistance, getting them out of bad neighborhoods, clean air, clean water. All of these kinds of expenditures are very good investments that have high rates of return. So remember, the reason to worry about the debt is to worry about the future. So what policymakers need to ask themselves, is it better to take a measure that lowers the debt, or is it better to borrow and invest in kids so that tomorrow they're richer and they can pay for this debt because we've now grown the economy, right? And when you think about, well, should you borrow? Why are you borrowing? Well, it's perfectly appropriate if you're going to increase your investment to increase your borrowing. You're then matching up the people who are benefiting from the money from the people who will be paying for it. So to the extent that what the government is going to be doing, and if you look at what the Biden administration is planning, so many of its priorities are really about addressing investments in human capital and in kids and in poorer kids, then I think you should say, I'd rather improve the future by spending money and borrowing for it than by saying, oh, I can't afford those expenditures. In fact, it's the opposite. You can't afford not to do them. And then I think there's a political consideration that comes on top of all this, which is, if you ask me what the most important thing that we should do to make the economy better and more productive, it's all those things I just talked about. You should tackle poverty, tackle inequality, increase social civility, broaden the social safety net, address pollution, get rid of the lead in the water, and fight climate change. Those are the keys, in my view, to a better future, right? If we start getting into this conversation about, well, you want to do those things, but make sure you pay for it, make sure you don't increase the debt, you will almost assuredly go small instead of going big, right? You will say, well, I can't raise taxes that much to pay for this, so I'm not going to do the whole thing that I want to do, right? Typically, people are loath to pay for things that they don't know about, right? We don't have these programs. People don't miss what they don't know. Once you enact them, people say, oh God, that's really good. We really wanted that. We should have had that all along. And so just from a political consideration, I think the thing to do is to enact these incredibly important things. This is a great opportunity, especially with interest rates so low. Go enact all these important things that will put the US on a better long-term path. And then we will have to pay for some of it eventually, but I think those are the decisions that can be delayed. It's much more important to make these investments. So in summary, when I look at my list of what's the best way forward to improve our future, worrying about the debt is not very high on my list. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Louise. Very informative. I love the idea of investing with the future and the kids. That's hopefully we'll be able to see some real returns on that strategy moving forward. All right, moving on to Dr. Marc Goldwein. Maybe I'll first pin Marc to the screen so everyone can see. So Marc is Senior Vice President and Senior Policy Director for the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, where he guides and conducts research on a wide array of topics related to fiscal policy and the federal budget. He is frequently quoted in a number of major media outlets and works regularly with members of Congress and their staffs on budget-related issues. In 2010, Marc served as Associate Director of the National Commission on Fiscal Responsibility and Reform, the Fiscal Commission, and in 2011, he was Senior Budget Analyst on the Joint Select Committee on Deficit Reduction, the Super Committee. He has also conducted research on the Government Accountability Office, the World Bank, the Historian's Office of the Social Security Administration, and the Institute of Governmental Studies at UC Berkeley. In addition to his work at the committee, Marc teaches economics at the University of California, DC, and at Johns Hopkins University, where he was the 2013 recipient of Excellence in Teaching Award. In 2011, Marc was featured in Forbes 30 Under 30 list for law and policy. Welcome, Marc.
Thanks so much for having me. Dr. Goldwein's my mother. I tapped out a master's degree. So I appreciate, she'll be happy to hear that I finally sprung for the doctorate, but it wouldn't be true. I'm really glad to be here now and get a chance to chat with all of you about what I think is a really important issue. As Louise mentioned, our debt is now larger than the economy for the first time, for really the only time in our history outside of World War II. By our estimates, it's going to breach that World War II record by the end of this year, possibly into next year, depending on GDP. It's going to be 113% under current law by the end of the decade. Within 30 years, CBO estimates debt will be twice the size of the economy. I think if you make some more realistic assumptions about various expiring provisions that'll be extended and how fast certain programs grow, it's pretty easy to come up with numbers of debt being closer to 250, perhaps even upwards of 300% of the economy within 30 years. So I think there's no disagreement that debt by historic standards is very high and growing. I think we also agree that the recent run-up in the debt was, for the most part, very justified. You know, when your barn is on fire, you don't worry if you have enough water to make it through, the next crop season. There are lots of good reasons to borrow. One is recession, and you need fiscal policy to essentially support the growth of the private sector isn't. Another is you have a national emergency like a war or something, and you want to borrow now and spread those costs over time. What we've experienced over the last, I can't believe it's been a year now, but over the last year is both, right? We essentially had the equivalent of a war. We had a pandemic and we had a recession. This is exactly the right time to borrow. It's the right time to borrow under sort of traditional Keynesian economics. It's the right time to borrow under basic theories of borrowing. You don't need to go to some abstract theory like modern monetary theory or anything like that to justify very large amounts of borrowing. And I think the data shows pretty clearly that U.S. fiscal policy of the last couple of years has been, over the last year, has been successful in mitigating the crisis. Between the first and second quarter of last year, the economy contracted 10%, which is massive, but could have been a lot worse. Other countries around the world saw contractions closer to 15, even 20% of GDP in some cases. And we are now probably at the point that the economy has just about recovered to pre-pandemic levels. Not yet as pre-pandemic trajectory, but we are producing about as much now as we were producing before the pandemic began. That's in large part thanks to fiscal policy, which has not only boosted GDP and I think helped support the recovery, and is going to help support it more in the coming years, but also kept incomes whole over this period. So I think there's pretty broad agreement. I think the last package we just passed of $2 trillion was on the too large side, but I think there's pretty broad agreement on the desirability and need and benefits of borrowing recently. The question is, can we sustain this? And my answer would be no. There are lots of economic, political consequences and economic policy and political consequences to borrowing. Louise talked a bit about the idea of crowding out. It's true, interest rates are low. They're almost a point higher than they were in September, but they're still, about where they were pre-pandemic, which is pretty low. But it's not clear they're going to stay low forever, and the data shows pretty clearly that they're low despite high levels of debt, not because of it. I think there's a lot of research out there that debt crowds out investment. It crowds out investment by pushing up interest rates. It crowds up investment through the exchange rate panel. And the ultimate consequence is the more people are buying in bonds, the less they are investing in the private sector, the less ultimate growth we get, particularly in periods unlike today when interest rates are not really close to the zero lower bound. Debt also pushes up interest payments. Look, in the last 20 years, going before the pandemic, interest rates fell roughly in half. Real interest rates fell roughly in half between 2020 and 2019. Despite that, interest payments were just as high in 2019 as they were in the year 2000. And that's because very high levels of debt. Even at very low interest rates, the higher our debt, the higher our interest payments. Today, in this period of extremely low interest, the federal government is spending more in interest payments than everything it's spending on disability benefits. We're spending about twice as much as interest as we're spending on infrastructure, transportation infrastructure. We're spending $300 billion in a very low interest period on interest payments. And the Congressional Budget Office thinks that that's going to rise, both as our debt grows and as interest rates grow, to the point that we'll be spending more within a decade on interest than we spend on defense. And within a quarter century, interest will be the single largest federal government program, larger than what we spend on Social Security, larger than what we spend on Medicare. In addition, and sort of separate from this debt issue, we have all these major trust funds that are projected to go insolvent. Look, the US government cannot go insolvent. I shouldn't say cannot. It cannot go insolvent, but for its own choosing. The federal government, we print on our own currency. It just happens to be the world's reserve currency that's not vital for this formula to work. But any country that prints its own currency can only go insolvent if it chooses to, because you can always print your way out of it. But we have a bunch of trust funds that are set up legally to be self-financing. Highways, for Medicare, for Social Security, disability, for retirement. All of those trust funds are projected to run out of funds, exhaust their reserves within the next 14 years. The Highway Fund next year, Medicare within 5 years, disability and retirement in the early 2030s. Could we just borrow more to finance them? Could we divert from general revenue? We could, but that would exacerbate the other problems, or at least be part of the other problems I dealt with. I just mentioned. And otherwise, we need to come up with solutions. We either need to change the amount of revenue coming in, reduce the spending going out, or some combination of the two. And lastly, while I mentioned the federal government can't go insolvent, that doesn't mean that debt is riskless. There's some risk of a financial crisis, fiscal crisis caused by a rapid swing in interest rates, caused by high levels of debt, or contributed to it. That risk, I think, is extremely low, but it rises with your debt level. Now, for a couple minutes, let me talk about sort of the politics of this all, because I think it's really important. It's true that I think in the abstract, some investments are certainly worth borrowing for. But most of the borrowing we do today is not for money on children. By the way, total spending on children is about 8% of the budget. It's a little more this year because of COVID relief. It's not mainly for infrastructure, about 4% of the budget. It's mainly for programs that go to seniors, for Social Security, Medicare, and to a lesser degree, Medicaid, which long-term care goes to seniors. So most of our borrowing today isn't going towards investments. Now, marginal borrowing might go towards marginal new investments, but we're still left with that underlying deficit that isn't fixed. We also need to be very careful about this narrative, which I don't think Louise is getting, but it's getting a little close to, that sort of every investment is worth it, and the one that goes a little further, that things pay for themselves, because it's very easy to I think, start with the literature and get to a place where any policy seems worth paying for. You got your tax cut, I should get my spending increase. Spending on children is worthwhile, therefore spending on all children is worthwhile, therefore spending on all children for all things. And I think that's the trap that we increasingly run into. The United States probably wouldn't reach sort of a breaking point for quite a while on our current debt trajectory is unsustainable as I think it is. But each time we add to the debt, we give license for the next person to add more to the debt and the next person after that. I think we're seeing the political economy of that. And it's really hard to unwind this, particularly when so many of our commitments are preordained 20, 30, 40 years in the future. So this is not to say that we should all have our hands on our hair on fire, that we're headed for a debt crisis. And it's not to say that we should be moving in the direction of balanced budget. But I think we do need to take seriously our very high levels of debt and factor that in when we're deciding how to pay for our investments. Just one last note I'll add, which is that if we pay for our investments the right way, we actually get a higher bang for buck out of them. Not only because we don't have the debt load offsetting it, but because we can choose pay-fors it themselves, help with the situation. If we want to invest in, reducing the mitigating effects of climate change, a carbon tax is a perfect twofer that both raises revenue to pay for your climate option and helps promote innovation in the private sector. If we're concerned about labor force participation and economic growth, changes to Social Security can send powerful signals for people of how much and how to save, work, invest, retire that can self-grow the economy. And maybe most importantly, if we want to make healthcare costs more affordable for Americans, we should probably make it more affordable across the board by actually identifying the kinds of policies that are going to lower healthcare costs. And there are lots of them that have support, I think, from Republicans and Democrats that could get us started. So, in conclusion, I do think we need to worry about the debt, and we shouldn't view pay-fors as a burden, but as an opportunity to enact a lot of policies that are absolutely necessary and would be beneficial to our economy. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Mark. Very informative. I didn't realize the impact that Medicare and Medicaid is currently having on the debt, and I like the ideas about lowering health costs and some innovation strategies around those. I think that'll be really interesting. So, all right, let me introduce our final panelist. Dr. Jack Mintz is the President's Fellow of the Public Policy at the University of Calgary after serving as the Palmer Chair and Founding Director from January 1st, 2008 to June 30th, 2015. He also serves on the board of Imperial Oil Limited and is the National Policy Advisor for Ernst & Young. His affiliations include Distinguished Senior Fellow, Macdonald Laurier Institute, Senior Fellow at the C.D. Howe Institute, and a board member of the Canada West Foundation. He is also a regular contributor to the Financial Post and is a member of the editorial board of International Tax and Public Finance. Dr. Mintz held the position of Professor of Business Economics at the Rotman School of Business from 1989 to 2007, Department of Economics at Queen's University in Kingston, visiting prof at Columbia Law School, New York University Law School, and president and CEO of C.D. Howe Institute from 1996 to 2006. He was founding editor-in-chief of International Tax and Public Finance, published by Kluwer Academic Publishers from 1994 to 2001. He chaired the federal government's technical committee on business taxation 96 and 97 that led to corporate tax reform in Canada since 2000. He currently serves as chair of the Alberta Premier's Economic Recovery Council, and Dr. Mintz consults widely with the World Bank, the IMF, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, federal and provincial governments in Canada, and various business and nonprofit organizations in Canada and abroad. Welcome, Jack.
Thank you very much. Let me first of all mention, I worked twice at the Department of Finance, 84 to 86. That was at the time many people remember was spending was far greater than tax revenues that were coming in at that time at the federal level, and growing debt GDP ratios at that time. And then I came back in 96 and 97 to deal with the aftermath of what happens when you don't have fiscal discipline, and it leads to very difficult consequences in which all of a sudden a country may have to go to the IMF to get a loan because they were having trouble selling their bonds to the international market at that time. And also you had significant contraction in government spending in order to get back on a fiscal track, which Canada did do for the next 14 years, or 12 years actually, where we ran government surpluses for 12 years to get back our debt GDP ratio that went to, at that time, roughly 120% of GDP, and brought it down to around 60%, if I recall, by 2007. And that includes what the provinces did as well. So it's I'm very, let me put it this way. I went through this whole story and problems associated with what happens when you let your debt go out of whack. And I've also worked in a number of countries in earlier years, which went through hyperinflations, major problems with their debt GDP ratios, and difficulties that governments had as a result. So I'm very sensitive to kind of the problems that can occur when debt does become unsustainable and creates significant tensions as a result. So let me first start with some numbers, because our numbers in Canada are quite different than the United States in many ways. So I looked up the International Monetary Fund numbers for 2018, which is the latest year that I could get, which were the gross debt numbers for Canada, both household, corporate, non-financial corporate, and general government. General government being all levels of government. And unlike United States, you cannot ignore the provinces. The municipalities tend to have very low debt in Canada because they have to keep their debt well below their revenues. And they also have a lot of assets that they invest in. But the provinces run quite large debts in Canada, which is unlike United States. And so it's really doesn't make much sense to just talk about central government debt, as in the case of the United States. Household debt in 2018 was about 103% of GDP in Canada. Non-financial corporate debt, which actually had grown quite a bit over the decade. It was not bad previously, but it had grown quite a bit, is 163% of GDP in 2018. And general government debt was 90% of GDP, for a total of 356% of GDP when you add all three together. And of course, when you're borrowing from abroad, some of that has to come from foreigners in order to satisfy the debts that are needed by all sectors of the Canadian economy. Now, in 2021, we know that general government debt, according to the IMF figures, have gone up almost by half, 90 to 116% of GDP. And it's even that number was based on October 2020. And we know that there's been some additional government spending at the federal and provincial levels. And so it's probably closer to 120, 125% by now. And that means that even though there was some reduction in household debt, maybe in 2020, there was still run up in 2019, and non-financial corporate debt has gone up. So I suspect that we're talking about debt now of all three sectors that are over 400% of GDP in Canada. So I think that's something to keep in mind. Now, when you're talking about general government debt, as Louise mentioned, you can't just talk about the actual debt that issued by government, so that's relevant. But you can also think about their future unfunded liabilities that are associated with the pension fund. And this is actually a big difference from Canada relative to the United States, is that we do have significant assets that have been held in order to fund future Social Security, unlike the US. And so our pension future unfunded liabilities are more along with the lines of old age security and a few other programs that we have. And that's about 15% of GDP net of these assets. And then healthcare is unfunded healthcare is also quite significant. It's about 44% of GDP. And so when you add it all up, government debt is getting to be closer to more like 175% of GDP when you including some of these unfunded liabilities that are there. Now, then the big question is, why do we care? And I guess we're hearing quite different views here, although I have to admit I'm probably more in Marc's line than I am with Louise's line. I think we care really for 6 reasons. The first one is the intergenerational effect. And I do agree that if governments are spending money on capital and education that increases productivity of the economy, then debt is not necessarily a problem. In fact, it may be something that you want to have, although it's not entirely clear whether you need to fund everything by debt or whether you can at least fund some of government expenditures with tax revenues, because some of these expenditures help current populations and not just future populations. So that's certainly an argument for having some debt and not being as concerned about it. And I totally agree with Mark's comments. Given the recession that we had and the pandemic, there was no question that there had to be a blowout of debt, which we've gone through right now, which is the reason we should keep in mind that there are contingencies that happen that we have to make sure we have firing power. And that's one thing Canada did do a good job by getting its act together in 1995, because when we hit the financial crisis in 2008-9 in Canada, and then now this pandemic, at least we were able to have a better financial position to be in to deal with that. But now that we've really blown our brains out on debt recently, the next contingency may be more difficult to handle than the current one. And that's something I'll talk about in a moment. The other argument, of course, is that we have to remember that debt is a future tax burden. And in fact, the line that Robert Barrell takes from Harvard is that if people anticipate these future taxes and they will save more today, which is part of the crowding out effect that Mark mentioned. It's not just through higher interest rates, which I'll talk about in a moment, but it's also this crowding out effect that if people anticipate future taxes to be paid, they end up saving more in order to set aside that money. Now, I don't know how perceptive my people are generally when they operate in that way, but certainly if you notice the significant increase in government transfers, which was far more in Canada. In fact, it was about household income actually went up during the pandemic by almost 10%. Because government transfers were more than the employment losses that people experienced. And so as a result, we've had a very significant increase in savings during that period, which is at the same time when governments were taking on debt instead. Not necessarily a bad thing, but it's just something to observe that happened. But it's also interesting that people actually, when they did spend money, they put it into consumer durables, housing, renovations of homes, as well as automobiles, et cetera. And that's actually a form of savings as well as not just consumption. In fact, they've kind of pre-bought their future consumption, which means that maybe some of that consumption will not be as forthcoming after the pandemic as people think, because people did upgrade a lot of their assets at this time. And then, of course, some people use the money to reduce some of their debt, their household debt as well. Now, of course, all these things are good, but one of the things to notice is that we've had not a great productivity performance here in Canada, worse than the United States, although the US productivity has been more of a challenge in recent years than it was in the past. And this is quite a contrast from the Second World War, where the Second World War, when the war was over, there was a very significant increase eventually in the employment rate as people came back and started working. You also had people forming families, and you had an increase in household formation. And at the same time, you had quite a good productivity boom in the United States as well as Canada after the war. And that helped deal with the big debt burden that came across. But unfortunately, Canada's productivity rate is really poor. In fact, from 2016 to 2020, including the 2020 period, it was negative. But if you don't include 2020, it was still only a 0.5 percentage point since 2015. And so per year. And if your population is only growing at 1%, then your normal growth rate is only 1.5%, which is far less than what it was back in the 1950s. And so therefore, that debt burden we're taking on is going to be even more difficult to deal with as a result of our productivity slowdown. And I don't expect a big productivity boom to happen in the future. I do think there's going to be some of that through private investment. But I think we're going to see a lot of government policies that are going to be investing in things that don't lead to necessarily higher productivity, which I would include, for example, huge investments in the energy transition, which is not going to generate necessarily high productivity, but will be necessary for other reasons, of course. Now that's, so my view is that the intergenerational effect of this high debt now, which we've had to accept, is going to be an issue for the future about how much more debt we can take on. And in my view, it's going to be more difficult because of low productivity and as well as aging and other effects that are going on in the economy. The second point is the fiscal sustainability argument, which is partly related to this, but you can think of fiscal sustainability as kind of the debt burden divided by GDP. It's gone up a lot, obviously. Of course, it doesn't have to keep rising as quickly. If debt doesn't rise very much and GDP grows faster, the debt burden is going to fall. So that's not so bad. But another way of thinking of it is also net interest expenses of the government relative to its revenues, which is kind of the interest rate times bonds divided by the tax rate as a share of GDP. And as we can see, the interest rates are very low right now, but my view is that those interest rates are bound to rise. And even going up from 1% to 3%, we've got to remember the tripling during that, in terms of that average. And our bonds, government bonds, of course, have gone up almost 50%. Now it doesn't, that's right now, but what about the future? And how much more can that allow for? Well, of course, that will depend on how much GDP rises. GDP rises a lot, and that revenue, that expenditure on debt isn't so serious, the interest expense. But if GDP does not rise very much, then that could be a problem, because that interest rate will rise to much, I believe, faster, as well as now that we've seen the debt rise quite a bit. As far as the tax rate goes, of course, that's a decision made by governments. And if governments end up raising the tax rate on GDP, which I think will hurt productivity and growth in GDP, then of course, we might see that debt, the amount of interest expense as a share of revenues may increase more than we think over the next several years as a result. And I have done some calculations to suggest that number will be rising quite a bit over the next 3-4 years, simply because of the additional debt that we take on, plus the fact that I believe that our GDP won't grow as fast as one thinks. Now, the other point I want to make has to do with risks. And the reason that people often save, of course, is not just to provide, let's say, money for their retirement or whatever, but they also save money because they want to have money, they want to have the ability to deal with risks and things like that. And of course, when you borrow money, you take on additional risks. And some of those risks, of course, that could be in the future, could be things that you don't expect that do happen. And war is a very good example of that, and pandemics, which we never thought we were going to go through this as we have this past year. And I think that has to be remembered, because the next time around, and we don't know when that's going to be, we could end up being in another situation, major recession, with another major run up in debt. And that is, and to the extent that your debt has, as a share of GDP, has gone up quite a bit already in the past, then you put yourself in additional risk where bond markets start looking at some countries of having more difficulty in being able to pay back that debt, particularly if they're running a current account deficit, where they are borrowing money in order to consume and to invest domestically. And if there's a large current account deficit, and Canada has had one recently and has had to borrow money, then eventually you could end up getting trouble when your foreign indebtedness, your indebtedness to foreigners as a share of GDP gets very high, which is what we went through in the 1990s. In the early 90s, that number became close to 40% in Canada. Then all of a sudden the market said, we don't believe that you can pay back your bonds. And so then the credit spreads go up in your bonds, et cetera. And of course, we see that today with some countries like Argentina, which has reneged its debt again in August, and other countries, which Italy and others, that actually had a very significant increase in their credit spreads right at the start of the pandemic. And those were the countries that had reviewed as highly risky. And so what we have to be careful about is for Canadians is that we don't get back into that world that we were once in, despite the fact that interest rates are so much lower. Just one final point that I want to make is that's the future of the savings and investment market globally. We've had a tremendous amount of savings available, slowdown of investment. And so it's not surprising that the interest rate is lower as a result of not much investment or not enough investment and a lot of savings. And a lot of savings has been because of the baby boomers that have been going through in populations throughout the world. But we are going into a world of aging and people dying off. And as a recent analysis has shown, is that we may be finding that in 30, 40 years, or maybe sooner, 20 years, that reversal. And if we are spending a lot of money on, let's say, something like energy transition, healthcare, et cetera, there's I've seen a forecast the other day for the cost of the energy transition worldwide to be $131 trillion for the next 30 years, which is $4 trillion a year. But if you're going through that, plus all the other needs that we have, then we could have a very, very significant demand for savings. At the same time, our savings will drop off because we are going to be having our elderly population that are going to be consuming their assets and not saving anymore. And so then all of a sudden we find, instead of that big surplus of savings that we've had relative to investment, which has led to low interest rates, that we start seeing real interest rates start rising. And then of course, if we have debt that ends up being monetized and causes higher inflation, which I think is a real possibility in the next several years, that we will see higher interest rates as well. So all those kind of suggest to me that we are on a track that could be serious unless governments deal with the debt burden. And that's going to have to be done with either government spending that really does boost productivity, which they've been very unsuccessful in doing so far in the past 30 years, or they're going to need to inflate the economy, so then the debt GDP burden falls only because inflation reduces the purchasing power of debt, or they start increasing taxes quite a bit, which did not happen after the financial crisis in 2008. In fact, the tax GDP ratio by 2015 was really no different than it was in 2007. So there was changes in tax policy, but there wasn't a big increase in the tax GDP ratio. So, and that's because people are reluctant to pay more taxes. And so it's not that easy for governments to keep raising them. But I can see things like I recently wrote about where governments start de-indexing tax systems for inflation, because that's like the UK has just recently done as a way of trying to raise a lot more revenue. So I think I'll stop there at this point.
All right, thank you very much, Jack. Furiously writing notes there. Really appreciate the insight. And I guess I'd like to open it up to questions right now. There's a questions tab on the bottom of your screen. If you can just type in any questions you've got, and I'll go through them as they come in. I do have a couple of questions to start, and actually I want to modify my first question a little bit based on what Jack was just saying in terms of how to get ourselves out of this, and that's regarding the spending to boost productivity. So the question I had originally was, the cover of The Economist last week featured a big piggy bank wearing shades titled Biden's Big Gamble. And the article focused on the amount the US is spending on the pandemic, at last count about $6 trillion. And putting in context, that's basically 3 Canadas. The goal of this spending is intended, as the article was saying, to avoid low inflation, low interest rate trap, and instead increase inflation above 2%. However, this runs the risk of overheating the economy and spilling over into other countries. For example, in recent weeks, Australia's central bank has had to increase its bond purchases to prevent yields from rising too much, and the European Central Bank was considering a similar intervention. So the original question I had was, so as economists watching this accelerant being added to the economy, what do you think are the best outcomes, best case, maybe a return to pre-pandemic growth? And what are the things that you're most worried about? And what I'm going to modify a little bit on this question is based on Jack's last comment on spending that boosts productivity. Are there some really good examples you can point to where spending has truly boosted productivity, and you can see clearly there how those examples work? So I guess the question is, who wants to sort of take a first stab at that one?
I will. I think there's two questions in there that are really separate. The productivity one is a long run kind of question, not a short run question. So let me bring it to you. On the productivity stuff, the stuff I mentioned was, you say, Jack said governments are very good at boosting productivity. Well, you always need a counterfactual. And so what I'm talking about are these very good studies that use administrative data that can basically track where kids lived when they were kids and follow them through their lifetime and figure out, because of the way policies were introduced, like causal effects of different policies, and the rates of return on spending money on families are extremely high. That is higher productivity, more human capital, better health. These are extremely productive investments, proven, like very, very good evidence. That's a long run thing. That's not what the Biden thing is about right now. The Biden plan, the 1.9 trillion, which is very large, on top of, we will have spent $5 trillion since the start of the pandemic in fiscal spending. It's huge. And nothing more
How many
than
Canadas is that?
What'd you say?
I said, how many Canada? Do it in Canadas. How many Canadas is that?
I do it in Canadas. I don't know. I should. I'm Canadian, but so the idea is, there's a few ideas in the package, but I actually did an analysis of the macroeconomic consequences of the $1.9 trillion. And if you take the Congressional Budget Office projection of what the economy would be doing if we didn't have the extra stimulus, it was going to take many years to get back to where we would have been had we not had the pandemic. Not to the level of activity, because you don't really want to do that, right? We always have growth, we have more population, we have productivity. You want to get back to the trajectory you would have had to have been at. With the stimulus plan and the vaccinations, you need sort of the combination, right? The reopening of the economy. We estimate that by the third quarter of this year, we will be back, and that we will even be so strong that by next year, we will have some makeup activity. So we will be above the level that we would have otherwise been. And that you can think of as people going out to eat more than they otherwise would have because they have money and they didn't do it. And, going on more vacations and all the things that have been suppressed, you can imagine temporarily having more. And then as the stimulus kind of wears off, GDP falls a little, but in our baseline, it was what you call a soft landing. It was ideal. Get it right up back there. And then here we are, and everything is a soft landing. What are the risks to that forecast? So the big debate in the United States, is that package too big? The debate isn't too much on the we can't afford it from a debt perspective. It's much more on the inflation side, right? Which is, you are going to be putting so much money into an economy, and if the ability to produce is less than it was before, because people are still home, because it takes time for businesses to reopen, people have left the labor force, then this is going to be really inflationary. And when things are inflationary, what has tended to happen in history is the Fed kind of slams on the brakes and you get a hard landing and you actually cause a recession, right? So there's two pieces required for that to happen. One, the Fed has to say, I don't want this inflation. Well, the Fed has been pretty clear that it wants inflation, right? It has a new framework that says we don't care about our target threshold anymore, 2% in a given period. We are looking over long periods at averages. We have an average inflation targeting framework. We would like some above 2% inflation because we have not hit our 2% target for years. So we welcome something that will actually boost inflation a bit, right? They will recognize it's temporary because it's coming from the reopening of the economy and this huge fiscal stimulus. And most likely, but never know, most likely sort of see through it. Never know if inflation's 5-6%, that's not what they're banking on. But if you see threes, I think it would be fine. And then the second question is, even if that happens, will they get it wrong? Will they get the hard landing? Or will they understand that they don't want the hard landing and be able to adjust it? We don't know. But the benefits of doing this, if you can actually get back to that trajectory quickly, those are huge economic benefits. All the people getting back to their jobs, all the GDP generated, like it's clearly worth it. So in my view, it is a gamble in a way. It's very large. It's saying the risks of doing too little are much worse than the risks of doing too much. And so we're going to err on that side.
Thank you, thank you,
So
Louise.
I think an issue, if I can answer the same question. Let me start where Louise ended, which is I agree the risk of doing too little is higher than the risk of doing much. But I think an issue with this bill is a question of it's maybe that we err on the side of doing 3 times too much instead of doing 10% too little. And so I think the base case scenario, which I'll tell you that I think there's potentially high potential benefit, some potential risk. I think the base case scenario is that this pretty much works, but at reduced effectiveness. I think, in other words, we may not get that much more out of $2 trillion than we would have out of $1 trillion, because at some point the economy is some supply constrained, and it'll either reflect itself in higher levels of savings or more inflation. And so I think my base case is that this pretty much works to juice the economy, but because it's such a large package, a lot of the money is sort of macroeconomically wasted. You kind of get lower multipliers. I think sort of the best case outcome from this is twofold. One, we learn potential is significantly more than we thought it was, and this allows us to boost there. And two, this allows the Fed to basically to really administer the reset that it's trying to prove that it's willing to have sort of two-sided inflation targeting, and that helps it down the interest rate targets better. It gives it a new level of credibility. So I think on the positive end, that'd be my best sell. On the risks, I think, Larry Summers and others worry about risks of sort of inflation because there's a lot of money going in this year relative to, especially if you think about how much of the output gap really is driven by demand constraints, people not having much money, like constraints. No matter how much cash is in the economy, a restaurant constricted to 25% capacity can't go over 25% capacity. So I think there is that high level of inflation risk. I put it like 10%. I don't think it's a huge risk, but I think it's enough to worry about. And then how the Fed responds to that risk. And if it does happen, the Fed's almost in a lose-lose situation because either way they lose credibility. They said they're not going to raise rates until 2023. So if they raise rates before that, they've undermined themselves. If they let inflation get way out of control, they've undermined themselves. And even this, Louise, your soft landing in your analysis for everything is really good. Isn't that soft? I mean, if GDP is shrinking a bit and our productivity is growing, it means people are losing jobs. I don't know what I didn't do the conversion to jobs, but it would probably be a soft landing scenario, a mini recession, and that would be tough for I think a lot of people to swallow. In the meanwhile, I worry a bit about some malinvestment and some assumptions. How many people are going to buy Disney Plus subscriptions because they're unlimited versus things they would actually want to buy if the economy wasn't so constrained. So I think there's all these smaller risks. I think that you start to mention sort of to what extent are we basically sort of crowding out other countries' debt? Yeah, that's happening with the large developed countries, but it's really happening in the emerging markets. So I think there's all these little consequences, but I really would bookend it in that there's some tail end very positive risks and some tail end very negative risk that this is pretty damaging. And in the middle, I think it's going to be effective but wasteful.
Could I think I'll provide probably quite a different point of view. First of all, I think we have to remember that this recession, this pandemic year was a supply shock. It was not a demand shock. I mean, it was demand shock that followed a supply shock, but it was a supply shock because people were told to stay home. And I do agree with Louise, when things, when the vaccinations come in and people start getting more confidence, they'll start going out more, and you'll see those services that really been very hard hit. So they will come back. Whether they come back to where they were before, we'll have to see. The airline industry, I think, is going to take time to come back. I think business travel is going to be changing because of the adoption of new technologies. I think we're in a different world post-pandemic, but there are going to be those things. But the other important thing we have to remember is that ramping up the economy is not a simple thing. And as we're already seeing with semiconductors that have been in short supply, we're seeing problems at ports and shipping and things like that. What's that telling us is that a very fast coming back could end up being more inflationary than one thinks, because the demand is going to be there, but the supply may not be able to catch up. Now that's the short run thing. And I think what we will see is as we measure GDP, it's going to be very high next year. And inflation rates are going to be definitely higher. I mean, I've looked at the Canadian numbers for, the year over year, which includes all the past year and the pandemic. Yeah, it's 1.4%. But as soon as we get over those quarters where we had actually a decline in prices, and in some cases, you're going to see inflation rates. I've already looked at like food and a whole bunch of categories. They're going to be in the 3% range very easily. The problem with the Federal Reserve policy, and which is not the Canadian one, at least yet, the Federal Reserve policy is that it's not clear how long and how high inflation is going to be tolerated. There's some talking about averaging, but it's not entirely clear to me what we're averaging, what period we're averaging, and things like that. So the market is going to be, in my view, very confused by Federal Reserve policy, which actually could lead to higher interest rates because people may believe that actually we may be getting into higher expected inflation rates where the Federal Reserve will be very afraid to call back or to raise rates because they may be afraid of causing a downturn in the economy. And certainly the stock market may be quite sensitive, I think, to higher bond rates, which is already starting to happen to some degree. So I think that the risks are actually much bigger with that $1.9 trillion package than one thinks. In fact, I think it was an unfortunate blowout. I think it was way too much money. And even that $1,400 an extra amount on top of the $600 that was given, the one-time payments, that was silly. I mean, really, I'm hoping, Canada, we're getting out of that stuff. And I hope we don't repeat it. But, we've done it because we had to do it. But it was totally unnecessary. Unemployment insurance benefits, absolutely. But giving one-time payments, it's a lump sum money. It has no behavioral effects. It has no productivity effects. It was a total waste of money, in my point. And that $1.19 trillion package was way excessive for what was needed. And I think that's the point that I think I found even over the past year for Canada, is that we had somewhat excessive spending. Not that some of it wasn't necessary, but the question is, did we need to run, a $330 billion deficit, or could we have gotten away with a $280 billion deficit? Those are some of the questions I think we should be seriously asking, which gets to the way that the benefits were how they were meted out and how they're being targeted, which I think is an important question.
Well, you have to understand what the $1,400 checks is. The previous president from the other party demanded it. So therefore, this president from the other party had to deliver it.
Yeah, I know that.
I'm being kind of snarky, but it's absolutely silly. You're right.
I don't care whether it was Trump or Biden. It was stupid. And so they both are dumb, but that's up to them.
All right, thank you very much for that, Jack. Let's see. Okay, I've got lots of other questions myself, but we have a few from the audience. So let me ask a question from John Kaysen. So it says, much is made about the threat of sustained deflation. Can we discuss as well how great a threat is the overall lack of confidence in the US dollar, the CAD, and other major currencies, and what could create such a lack of confidence? Who wants to tackle that one first?
I mean, I'll say one potential upside of all this is I think that we've significantly reduced deflationary risk. And, in my upside scenario, I think we've given the Fed the opportunity to reset expectations in a way that, could be helpful for years or even decades to come on that risk.
I want to second that, and I want to bring it back to something that would have been part of the debt discussion like even a year ago that I didn't mention, which was this fear of secular stagnation, right? Before the pandemic, what people were worried about, interest rates are so low, with inflation so low, the Fed has no room to operate. And the only way to keep the economy at full employment is with a lot of fiscal stimulus. And a lot of us thought that the Fed should raise the inflation target. And then people said, well, how are you going to ever let them get there? They can't even hit their 2% target. So I totally agree with you on the fact that this is a great opportunity. And not only that, but the Fed is talking differently. They're not just talking about employment. They're going to be looking at employment across groups. They are talking differently about the economy. And this will be a chance for them to prove it, which will give them credibility And so I do agree with you that inflation really is high. That puts them in a bad position. And I also really agree with you, Mark, that one of the reasons I am excited about the 1.9, even though I see it as obviously on the large side relative to a lot of metrics, is this idea. Before the pandemic started, the unemployment rate was 3.5%. Any economist would have told you, not any, most economists would have told you a year or 2 or 3 years before that our natural rate of employment was above that it would be, you'd get a lot of inflation. The Fed in past years would have preemptively raised rates to prevent the inflation that they imagined would have come if the unemployment rate fell to 3.5. They did not do that. 3.5% unemployment rate is really, really good for marginalized members of society. And we don't know how low the unemployment rate can go or how high the labor force participation can go. We've seen this huge decline in labor force participation of 50 and 40-year-olds, of prime age men and women, not just because of age. And one of the things it's an experiment, but if it turns out that our potential GDP is a lot higher than we thought, that is an experiment with huge returns. So risky, yes, but huge potential benefits, which what Mark said, and I think that's exactly right.
Great, thanks, Louise. That leads into the second question, unless Jack, did you have anything you wanted to contribute there?
Oh, no, actually, I kind of agree with those points. I was just going to add that, when I looked at, I've done some work recently on investment and productivity, and I mean, this is where Canada is lacking. It's a very different position, and I agree with the points that Louise and Mark were making. First, our monetary policy has been different. I mean, we've had a 2% target. It's almost been that on the core inflation rate. We've been pretty close to that. We've had, I wouldn't say that we've had the same sort of issues that the United States have had on the monetary policy side. We've always had a band between 1 and 3, so it's been kind of understood that inflation could go up to 3, and it's not the end of the world. And expectations have been at 2, and we've been pretty well at 2. It's not. It's a very different kind of story here. Where our story also differs a lot is with respect to investment. I've looked at the numbers from 2015 on for all the OECD countries, including public and private investment. The US has actually done relatively well during that period. Not big bang, but reasonable. Ours was -5%, was negative. We actually had a decline in investment in the past 5 years. So before going into this pandemic, we already had a productivity problem. We've had a private investment problem. And so coming out of this pandemic, we need to do something about our productivity. That's why I get focused on it so much. And we have to do something about our investment climate. And otherwise, we are going to have serious problems down the road, because you can have if you don't have good productivity, then you cannot get the benefits that you can get in terms of dealing with inflationary expectations. Because one of the things that helps inflation get kept down is productivity. It helps keep the inflation rate down. And I think I'm right now, I would put more of a bet on the US in dealing with that than Canada right now. And that's why I get very concerned about the productivity impact.
Thanks, Jack. And actually that leads into a question from Benedict Hansen. He asks, is investment towards infrastructure, roads, highways, bridges, airports considered to be raising productivity in Canada? I guess, Jack, back at you.
Oh, I think the answer is yes. I mean, when you look at the post-Second World War, the big productivity boom was partly just transportation. It was also household goods and what people could do in terms, washing machines and all sorts of other things. We had a huge productivity boom. We're getting a big productivity boom potentially with the digital economy. And again, this is an area where the US is ahead of us in terms of the implementation of that digital economy. In fact, one of the weaknesses that Canadians have, and this is why the private investment is so important, is that when you are investing in new goods and services or in new capital, you're bringing along also the latest vintages of capital and the new technologies along with it. So if you're investing in digitization and you're investing in all these other things, that shows up in your private investment numbers. And that's where we've been weak in a lot of sectors. This is not just a resource sector issue. It also applies to manufacturing and other sectors. And so I think I think that's why we have to be, it's not just public infrastructure that matters, it does, but it's also private investment matters. And in fact, a lot of our telecommunications is private investment. There's not a lot of public investment in that area. And that's going to be an important one for digitization for the future.
Thanks, Jack. I don't know, Louise or Mark, you had a thought from the US side?
Yeah, I think from the, I can't say comment much on Canadian infrastructure, but we're about to have a huge debate in the United States over what might be anywhere from $500 billion to $5 trillion infrastructure package, depending on who you ask. And I think it's, I think it's clear historically that infrastructure and that maintaining a strong infrastructure is productivity enhancing in some sense. But I'm very worried about the potential for overpromising here in terms of what infrastructure can do. Again, we're kind of, we heard in 2017 tax cuts pay for themselves, which they obviously don't. I'm seeing a lot of similar infrastructure pays for itself. You need to understand, for something to pay for itself in the sense that, it's self-financing, it needs to maybe produce $5 or $6 of GDP for every dollar you spend. And it's not clear if when we do a really big infrastructure package, we're going to have much of a return at all. And Penn Wharton and the Congressional Budget Office and others have looked at this, and they've basically found, a lot of infrastructure, federal infrastructure spending on net doesn't have very much of an economic return. We have very high costs on infrastructure, so we spend an awful lot relative to maybe what we could. A second is a lot of the returns are not really GDP returns. Build roads, yes, people can get to work faster and produce a little more, and freight can move faster, but a lot of those returns to roads make people's lives better, but don't reflect itself in the GDP data. But I also think we get a little confused when we take the anecdote and we scale it up. We can obviously find a bunch of infrastructure projects that are extremely high return. But when we're dealing with $1 trillion, $2 trillion of stuff out there, we're going to invest in a lot of, I'm not going to use a bad word, but we're going to invest in a lot of bad stuff too. A lot of very return investments, a lot of, whether it's for political reasons or not. And so I'd be very skeptical about overstating the returns of infrastructure, although I do think a sensible infrastructure package with especially a focus on climate would be smart.
I'm going to actually agree with Mark, which is surprising. When I talk about investment, I always talk about kids because the evidence there is really good. We actually, at where I work, commissioned 2 papers about 2 or 3 years ago, but trying to get the rates of return on investment in families and kids and the rates of return on investment in physical infrastructure. And the truth of the matter is, it's not that infrastructure doesn't necessarily have yields. We don't really know. The evidence is terrible. It's very hard to do. It's really, really hard to have the counterfactual, to have the natural experiment, to have the grants. So we don't really know. Obviously, maintaining current roads is important, and maintaining them at a regular rate is important, because if you wait too long, it gets much more costly. But I think that, that when I think about improving the future, I think we have to do some infrastructure and climate, obviously. And climate is a matter of not making the world terrible, as opposed to making it better than, a non-climate change trajectory. But I'm not convinced on big physical infrastructure that's hugely productive.
I mean, if you're thinking about what things would you want to borrow for, I know there's a lot of folks who say, well, interest rates are low, infrastructure is a return, we should borrow for infrastructure. I'm not so convinced. That bonds roll over, bridges depreciate. But climate, if we can do things now that prevents the warming of the globe over the next 10, 20, 50, 100, 300 years, those are perpetual returns and the type of thing that I do think we should be making serious investments in.
Definitely.
All right, thank you very much for that spirited exchange. I guess I'll keep on the questions. So Brian Dessaw has asked, what does the panel think about CERB and QC? So CERB, I don't even know what that stands for, but I think it's the Canadian Wage Benefits System. So I don't know if we had a similar issue in the US where wages were subsidized.
No, that's no. CERB is the Canada Emergency Recovery Benefit.
Oh, thank you, Jack.
That's the money that went to the individuals, it wasn't the wage subsidy.
Okay, so I guess, yeah, so the wage subsidy, so kind of like those checks that were sent to the individuals.
Yeah, that was CWS. No, that was not CERB.
Thank you for the correction. and the money being used by corporations to pay dividends rather than protect employees and customers. So I don't know. So what does the panel think about those things?
Well, let me just, that's a very Canadian question, so let me start. So the kind of emergency recovery benefit, which started off when the pandemic hit, was something that was paid out right away. There was very little testing. You know, there wasn't an attempt to try to target it to certain groups or whatever. It was money that was given right away, subject to certain qualifications that people had to, you know, show that they lost jobs or hours of work and things like that. But it was the individual that got the money, and it was at $500 a week, which, you know, raised some issues for some businesses because they found it later on it was harder tracking some of their workers back because it was they were getting paid more than they would normally get, you know, just working part-time for them. But, you know, there was a correction done to that in June. But I would say that that was a program that, you know, you can always talk about maybe could have been designed a little bit better, but it was one that was done quickly and it was handled very well. And it supported the population very quickly. We were slow in getting off the wage subsidy program for businesses, but it was eventually brought in. And the controversy over that is that some people said, well, you know, businesses should have been prevented from paying out dividends if they were claiming the wage subsidy, or doing share buybacks. The problem with that is that you know, dividends share buybacks are one thing you could shut off very easily. I mean, it's, you know, it's usually a company puts out a share buyback program and you can shut it off right away. It doesn't have an impact on a direct, you know, it doesn't have a signaling effect, you know, for the business. It's not a big deal from that point of view. But dividends are very sticky and very important signal about health of the company. And companies that cut back their dividends, like Suncor did during the pandemic period, ended up losing a lot of their share value. And that gave bad signals. And of course, it could trigger problems with covenants and all sorts of other problems when these things happen. I think if we had rules around the wage subsidy that said you cannot pay out dividends, I think most companies would then say, okay, we'll just fire the workers and they can collect the CERB instead. And that's what would have happened. I think it was kind of silly to argue if you wanted to say, well, you cannot give bonuses to executives and you cannot increase dividends. That would have been one thing, but to sort of say you cannot pay out dividends, I think would have been. I think most companies would say we can't take the money then. We'll just fire the workers. It'll be a lot better.
Thanks, Jack. Louise or Mark, anything from south of the border? Oh,
I mean, the United States. Sorry, Louise, you can go.
Oh, go ahead. It's fine.
I was saying we had a similar program that was an add-on to unemployment benefits, which maybe accidentally arrived at a sort of reasonable place in a really horrible way, which is at first we gave everyone $600 a week supplement, which meant the average person for several months was making maybe 40% more in unemployment than in work. And then we gave them no supplement for a while. And then we gave them $300, then we gave them nothing again. And now we sort of settled at $300 for a while. At a $300 a week supplement, the average person is making about the same on unemployment as they would be making in the workforce. I think that'd be a very unwise policy for a normal recession to go that high, although America's unemployment is too low. But in the context of a pandemic, when the jobs really aren't available in many cases, I think it's reasonable and certainly helped a ton in keeping spending going and keeping balance sheets strong in the United States.
Actually, that the unemployment insurance benefit was one of the most interesting changes that we've made. That, as Mark said, like it just keeps coming back. Like it expired and then it came back and expired. And I think it's going to be, if we don't reform the unemployment insurance system, because regular unemployment insurance benefits are terrible, particularly in some states. Like no one gets them and they barely release, anything. Florida. I think, it's interesting that we did it this time. In the Great Recession, we raised benefits by $25 a week. This time we did it 600. It was just a whole different perspective because it was the pandemic and it was sort of no one blamed anybody, that we were willing to replace, and just in general, we were willing to replace more income this time and make sure everybody was covered. That's what the checks were about. There's some people that have fewer hours, there's small business, there's losing money. We just like threw money, and we are going to be spending the next 5 years trying to understand what the implications were. And I think a lot of this stuff will have lasting impact on how we deal with recessions, typical recessions. So we had the same thing, and we had the same thing on the businesses. We had many rounds of what it's called the Paycheck Protection Program. It was basically grants to businesses if you kept your people on the payroll. And it was done very quickly. It was very novel. Every small business got them, even ones where everybody was completely fine working from home. And so it was that same thing, which was sort of not well targeted. Our next rounds were more targeted. They were smaller businesses, particularly money if you're in like, hospitality and stuff. So very similar. And every country, I think, try to like protect, their economy, partially because it was the government shutting them down in some sense. And so it felt more like, well, if we're going to do that, we have to make up for it.
Yep. Thank you, Louise. I know we're approaching the end of the session. I've got a couple questions. I'll start with Tariq Abu Salih. I'm sure I'm slaughtered the name. My apologies. What are the factors determining the strength of the Canadian dollar against the US dollar?
I can give that a very fast answer because I know the Bank of Canada model in the past. There's probably 3 important factors: the differences in interest rates between Canada and the United States. So when the US interest rates go up, that's actually going to push the Canadian dollar down, and vice versa. Second factor is the resource economy. In the past, it used to be kind of the non-oil and gas prices. Now it's oil and gas played a bigger role later on after 2000, but commodity prices play actually quite an important play a role in pushing up the Canadian dollar, and that's because we are a more resource-based economy than the United States. And then the third is our indebtedness to the world. The foreign debt as a share of GDP plays a role in explaining the exchange rate.
Thanks, Jack. Looks like we got one more question quickly come in from Cam Ross. There are 2 areas of predictable future US government spending: defense and climate change mitigation. Like national infrastructure requirements, there's a huge demand for defense modernization due to emerging Chinese, Russian, and cyber threats. At the same time, climate change is prompting interest in mitigating natural disasters. How does the panel reconcile these demands with the need to control debt to GDP ratios?
Well, my view is I'm not all that worried about debt to GDP. I'm going to I wanted to respond to the other 2 of them on this. So I'm going to take a quick segue back into debt to GDP and debt sustainability. So I didn't want to sort of be too wonky, but I gave this sort of analysis that, which was the amount of interest that you have to pay in order to keep your debt to GDP ratio constant is not the interest rate times your debt. It's the interest rate minus the growth rate of your economy times your debt. So there's this whole discussion in economics, you'll hear there's R&G, interest and the growth rate. When your interest rate is below the growth rate of your economy, you can actually roll over your debt and your debt to GDP ratio doesn't increase, right? It's like, well, my GDP increased 3% and my debt only increased 1%. So it goes down all by itself. The Congressional Budget Office and its projections, which have much higher interest rates than the market expects, has that negative thing where you really can just roll over your debt without increasing your debt to GDP ratio for like 20 years. And so what's interesting about it is the 80s were a period where interest rates were quite high relative to GDP. Jack Mintz, the post-World War. In much of history, R minus G is actually very low or negative, like it is now, not like it was in the sort of boom, from 60 to 2000. And even though it's true, we don't expect the kind of productivity that happened after World War II, nonetheless, our interest rates relative to the growth rate of the economy are basically in line with that. So that R and G are about the same as they were then. And that is a place where debt is much more sustainable. So I don't think that I think it's more important to tackle climate change. I'm not a defense specialist at all. I won't touch that one, but I think it's more important to tackle our big problems than to say, well, we can't do it because of the debt.
Okay, so Louise, I disagree with you on 2 points. Number one is that your IG minus comparison, if you look at a lot of the work, it's done since Second World War. And yes, there was a period when it was high, interest rates were higher. That was kind of in the 1960s and 70s, 1960s and the 70s period, which is when kind of countries got in a lot of trouble. But there has been some IMF work talking about mean reversion. And so you can end up going the other way. But I've actually did a calculation, at least for Canada, the interest rates minus the growth rate, when you include the 2020 period from 2015 to 2020, actually growth rates were less than the interest rate. Why? Because of the pandemic year, which is to tell you that you cannot discount the bad things happening. And that's when, and the other point is that you can get primary deficits. And one of the reasons Canada got into big trouble in the 1970s and 80s is that they started running large primary deficits from about 1975 to 1987. And that is one of the reasons why the debt GDP ratio went up so much. It wasn't just because of I minus G, but it was also because interest rates minus growth rates. It was also because of these large primary deficits. Right now, we're running very big primary deficits, huge.
And if I could just build on that, I mean, that's the real sustainability challenge that the United States faces. Look, if we were to run primary balance, so long as our interest rates are below our growth rate, our debt is sustainable, but we're not. Due to basically 3 factors, 2 that are built in and 1 that, I think this panel is helping to make worse. The age of the population, rising healthcare costs, and the fact that sort of each cohort of politicians wants to cut taxes and increase spending more than the one before it. We have high and rising primary deficits, so much so that, look at the same CBO projections over 20 years, debt to GDP is in fact not falling, but rising because of those primary deficits. I think 2 other factors to keep in mind. Your growth rate getting faster than your interest rate buys you a lot, but the more you borrow in debt, the higher your interest rate and the lower your growth rate. So in other words, the more you take advantage of G being greater than R, the less of it you have left. And 2, we don't live in a world, nor do I think we could, where we have all 30-year debt and we have planned to time to plan and adjust. It takes a while to adjust our commitments, to adjust our tax commitments, to adjust our spending commitments. But interest rates can shift relatively quickly. I think in many ways faster than our commitments. So I do worry about our debt sustainability, despite interest rates being lower than our growth rate. As for the defense versus the climate, we spend almost nothing on climate right now. We spend an awful lot on defense. I'm not saying we should swap those, that would be crazy. But I think a little bit of one could come out of a little bit of the other and we'd be just fine.
Well, I just want to mention, just to get back to Cam's question, the defense and it's kind of an interesting question, because when you think about spending money on defense, the question, does that actually improve GDP growth over time? You could make an argument it does, because actually one of the things that's well known is that a lot of innovation comes from defense expenditure. Necessity breeds innovation, and and the history of mankind, or people kind, when you read going back over the centuries, actually military expenditure was one of the things that actually drove up innovation in a lot of countries, which is kind of interesting. But then on the other hand, climate change, there may be some innovations that will come out of the spending on that. But to remember, value added per working hour is highest in the fossil fuel industry, at least in Canada. I can't talk about, I'm pretty sure that would be true in the US as well. And so when we move away with that, we're going to be substituting jobs that are going to have lower value added per hour working hour. We have to remember that. And so my view is that, and why is that? Because remember, we're going to be spending money on doing things we wouldn't have done otherwise. And we're doing it for a good reason. I think Louise put it very well. This is to avoid problems in the future. This is not a way of enhancing GDP, but it's a way of dealing with some other things that we would worry about, but it's not captured by GDP numbers. And so we have to do it, but we have to remember that it's going to have an impact on GDP and value added, and we should be not blasé about it, which is why I keep on pushing that any climate change plan we talk about, we should know what the least cost path of getting there is. And one of the problems I find is governments they have not yet tried to do the kind of work that's required to tell us what is the least cost method of getting to whatever target we want to on climate change. And the only country I've seen do that is New Zealand in a study. There may be others, but New Zealand actually took that quite seriously. They looked at 3 plans and said, here are the costs of getting to net zero by 2050. And basically what they said in the end is that we have to invest in these kinds of technologies, and we need these technologies in order to achieve the target. And that's what I have not seen yet.
Well, we're 2 minutes past. I really appreciate everyone's contribution. I wish we could stay for longer. I'm personally quite enthralled with this discussion. I really appreciate everyone's contribution on this panel. And I guess a couple of wrap-up notes just for everyone. I guess start with a special thanks to all the panelists. This is our first panel that we've done for here with CIC Prince George. So I really appreciate everyone stepping up and providing their thoughts on this first panel. Louise and Marc in the US and Jack here in Canada. A couple of takeaways from my perspective. I mean, the contingency for future firepower is something that's still in the back of my head. I think Jack mentioned that earlier. I mean, we've kind of spent a lot on this current pandemic, and we're what, 20 years into the 21st century, and we've already had 3 major shocks to our system. What does that next shock look like? So certainly something I'll be thinking more about. And something that really sort of grabbed my attention is really, how do we focus in on areas that really boost spending productivity, whether it be, the innovation that comes out through military spending or what Louise was speaking with, or investment in kids, and the idea that really focusing on the things that are really going to drive economic growth so that we can, well, if only grow our way out of this challenge, because the other options of massive taxation or cutbacks are I guess, least appealing from a non-economist perspective anyways. And I guess I'd like to finish off with really an invitation. If anyone is interested in visiting British Columbia ever, please reach out to me. I'd be happy to give you a personal tour of the province. If you like anything outdoors, if you like fishing, I can certainly line you up there. And a special thank you to all the attendees as well. And for anyone that's not involved with CIC Prince George yet and you're interested in joining, please reach out to me, Sean Simmons. I guess I don't have a chat, so I can't put my name into the chat box. But anyways, you can look at thecic.org and you can sign up there. And I guess without further ado, any final words from Louise, Jack, or Marc?
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, that was great. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, everyone. Till next time, tight lines.
Bye.